What's up, everyone? Mulligan here, and today I want to talk about what I've learned playing Rakano Burn and where I'm at with it now. So some of you will be able to tell, but just really quickly, I will mention that the game plan for this deck is an aggressive deck that deals as much damage as possible with early game units, and then uses direct damage and a little bit of evasion to finish off opponents in the mid game. For all you Magic the Gathering veterans, this deck is closer to red deck wins than anything else, with the Eternal equivalent being mono fire. It's just two colors. I will also mention that this is not a tier 1 deck. It's probably not even a tier 2 deck. I say this because I've been playing this deck off and on since around April when Unearthly posted the initial deck list on Discord. So at least 6 months now, maybe longer than that. So you can imagine that this episode has been a long time coming. I did play this deck last season and it served me pretty well in the Diamond ranks. I got around a 55% win rate with it before I stopped playing it in Diamond 2. There's more context to that, but I'll mention that later in the video. And I'll also go through specifics on some of the cards later on as well. But first, a little history on why I even decided to pick up this deck and keep it around, since this is not something that people have really played since probably season 2. So I want to go to the original list that I had for a very long time. So this is the initial list, but the first time I actually became aware of Rakano Burn was when Lightning Ball talked about it in his blog when he used to blog about Eternal. It was a player named Wise Guy that played Rakano Burn to rank 2 master back during closed beta in October of last year. Earlier this year, I want to say around March or April, Rakano Rally hit the scene featuring Frontier Jito when it used to cost 1. The deck was very similar to the Stone Scar Jito decks you still see even now, but shortly afterwards, Frontier Jito was nerfed to 2 cost. A few weeks later, Unearthly posted this deck list, and I took this exact list to master in Season 7, 2 weeks before Omens of the Past released. Keep in mind, this was when Flame Blast and Charchain Flail still had Powersurge. However, the effects of the Charchain Flail nerf, and even more so the Flame Blast nerf, have definitely weakened the deck. Unearthly himself said the original list was a rough draft, and even though the deck wasn't optimized, I was still cheesing out wins because the deck ran 4 Flame Blasts. Now, despite this, I still feel that the old Flame Blast kept control players honest and forced them to finish the game instead of playing with their food, if you will. But I'm mostly over the nerf now. I thought that the metagame was going to get a lot greedier after the nerf, but it hasn't. And I'm glad I've been wrong, at least so far. Anyway, after the nerf, I felt I needed to decide between one of 2 game plans. Either the go wide plan, where you flood the board with a bunch of units, similar to the Rakano Rally decks of old and the Stone Scar Jito decks of now, or the direct damage plan that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. This original list, in my opinion, did both of these well enough. But after testing the deck after the nerfs, I immediately saw that it could no longer do both. I had to choose. Now, I felt that because of Bandit Queen specifically, Stone Scar was objectively better at the go wide plan. While if I went with the burn plan, going back to the current list, there are at least a few cards Rakano has that don't make it a worse version of Stone Scar. At least a Stone Scar burn deck. So I went with the latter. and I stuck with the burn plan. Now because of that, I had to look for other ways to deal direct damage to make up for the loss of Flame Blast and Charchain Flail, which were both pretty awful post-nerf in my testing. Missing that extra point of damage was that big of a deal. But anyway, that's why you see other cards in this deck like Sword of Ikaria, an additional copy of Obliterate, and Soulfire Drakes. And even Crimson Firemaw makes the list, whereas before, the deck played no 4-drops whatsoever. One other thing I found I had to do was change my playstyle due to the nerf. Previously, I had more room to play more patiently around cards like Harsh Rule due to Flame Blast and Charchain Flail's burst damage. Now that I no longer run them, I've had to play this deck more all in and can't really respect board wipes like Harsh Rule and Lightning Storm anymore unless it's a very specific situation. And usually those situations involve you already having lethal over the next X turns, so playing an extra unit doesn't change the combat math. But I still have Obliterate and Soulfire Drake kind of counts as a burn spell, but they just don't match up to what Flame Blast was for this deck, so I have to take more risks nowadays. Now, I would argue that after the removal of the Powersurge mechanic, this type of deck was nearly unplayable. But Horus Traver gave us Crimson Firemaw, which has given the deck some life back. Now, despite the 55% win rate I mentioned earlier, the metagame has still been hostile toward this type of deck game plan. At least I feel. Not just for this deck, but for most fire-based aggro decks in general. Even Stone Scar, an archetype known for its resilience through many different metagames despite all their nerfs, has been taking a hit. However, with the nerf to Bartholo, Argenport decks can no longer curve him into a Lethrai Falchion for massive life gain. So decks like Burn Queen, and possibly even this one, may have a chance to gain a foothold again in the meta. We'll just have to see. But let's go over a couple of cards. And for those that know this series, you know I do not go through this list card by card because these aren't deck techs. They're just discussion pieces, really. But there are a few cards I want to touch on. The first being District Infantry. This was in Unearthly's original list, and it's still here for consistent turn 1 plays. I am a big believer in having all your 1-drops be from the same faction. Now, this being a Justice unit can throw things off, but in this case, this deck wants to hit the ground running as fast as possible, and I think he's better than Grenadin Drone, so I've kept him around. Fearless Nomad, pretty decent card, though it's not really a 1-drop. The only time you will ever play this on turn 1 is with Seed of Glory undepleted, which is almost never. But I've grown to really appreciate the overwhelm on this card, especially if it gets a Warcry or you can give it equipment through Igen. You get in situations where overwhelm really helps you push through those last few points of damage. And Pyro Knight can do it too, but Nomad is better than her at finishing the game most of the time. Nomad is a terrible blocker, but if you're blocking with this deck, that means you're losing 9 times out of 10. So Kayla's Favor, same as District Infantry. Unearthly ran 3 in his list. I did go down to 2 copies at one point, but I upped it back to 3 after testing out Piercing Shot, and Piercing Shot did not work out, but more on that later. It's definitely better than Piercing Shot when there's no good unit to hit, and helps you get to your big burn cards like Soulfire Drake and Obliterate as far as getting the power to play them. But between these and the actual power, I've got 29 power sources, which has been working fine, being that my curve goes up to 5. So one I'm sure that all of you are curious about, and that is Igen Imperial Armor, or Egen, I should say. So Ijin is definitely the odd card in this list, but Ijin was the reason the deck ran no 4-cost cards for a long time. This might be the weakest card here, but she is a must-answer threat at the end of the day. Unearthly ran 2 copies, and I've stuck with it. I personally wouldn't run more than 2, and there is another card I would try out to replace her, but I'll talk about that later. She's normally the last unit I play from my hand, just so I have as many chances to use her ability as possible. But she will win games for you if you curve into her on turn 3 and then hit 4 power afterwards. Also, if Crimson Firemaw hits this, it's absolutely insane, since you play her for free and then activate her ability. So she doesn't look like she fits the game plan, but she absolutely does by just giving your other units a ton of burst damage with the Mithril armor. Fearless Nomad and Pyro Knight are 2 of my favorite targets since they have Overwhelm. And the dragons are great too, but that happens far less often. But yeah, I like her in this type of deck. She's good. I also want to talk about Sword of Ikaria. Now, I was nervous about putting these in at first, but it's been a solid card. It's not super efficient damage-wise compared to something like Torch, or even some of your 1-drops, but it just feels good to equip this and just swing for 3 at anything, including face. And by the way, in this deck, you usually want to slam this turn 3 and swing, even if the board is empty. You need to get as much damage in as possible before your units become obsolete, so your bigger burn cards can finish the game for you. Using this as removal to clear the way for your 1 and 2 drops is just gravy. There's one small change I'm considering regarding this card, but I'll mention that towards the end. I'm not cutting them entirely though. They perform pretty well. And finally, I want to talk about Crimson Firemaw and Soulfire Drake together. So after trying to make this deck work after the Flame Blast nerf, I put the deck down since I couldn't even get a positive win rate against the field at the time. And then Horus Traver came out and gave us Crimson Firemaw, so I gave it another shot, and the deck definitely feels more solid now. Again, it's still not at the power level it was before though. Rakano doesn't have access to Impending Doom, so Firemaw is the best option at 4 costs for them. A very strong synergy with Ijin, like I mentioned earlier, as well as your other 5-cost cards. Now, as far as Soulfire Drake, this has been in and out of the list. I tried it before Firemaw came out, and I really didn't like how I couldn't guarantee flying or charge because none of the other units I ran had either. Burn Queen at least has Impending Doom. But now that Firemaw's out, I put them back in and they've been solid, keeping me in games I had no business being in. Soulfire Drake definitely helps fill the Powersurge gap, though not completely. So one thing I want to mention, it's actually a question that I want to answer that I'm sure some of you have probably asked already, is why should I play this deck over Rakano Plate? And the answer is quite simply, all your cards do some form of direct damage, unlike Plate, which has units that deal damage and weapons that can't deal damage unless a unit is in play. Also, it's not like Rakano Plate has been in a great spot lately either. You can still hit Masters with the deck on ladder, but it hasn't exactly been tearing up the tournament scene. Now, it's possible that may change with the nerf to Bartholo, however, since Argenport has definitely lost a key piece when it comes to abusing lifesteal. But again, we'll see. So now we've reached the point where we get to talk about previous cards that have been in this deck. And I'll lead off with Charchain, Flail, and Flame Blast. I just briefly want to mention these two, since I already talked about them in length earlier regarding their changes. But Charchain Flail, after the nerf, I tried 1 copy, and then when Horus Traveler came out, I cut it all together to add Crimson Firemaw in. Flame Blast, I tried 4 copies still, even after the nerf, and then I went down to 2 copies after that. And then by the time Horus Traveler came out, I cut them entirely. The next card I want to talk about is Grenin Drone. So the original list had 21 drops in it. When I played it back then, I always felt this was the weakest 1-drop out of all of them. I even preferred having Fearless Nomad over this. It's a good turn 1 play to stop opposing 2/1s if you're on the draw, and does help you go wide if you need to, but otherwise it doesn't do much of anything. In particular, I hated when this caught a Warcry from an Oni Ronin or a Rakano Outlaw. Now, despite everything I said, I could still see myself running these again. It just depends on how the new meta ends up. Next card. Yep, I gotta talk about Groundbreaker. The most overhyped card from Omens of the past, at least in my opinion. So the story behind Groundbreaker is that I wanted to get a 4-drop into this deck after cutting Flame Blast and Charchain Flail, so I tested 3 copies of this card, and once again it was absolutely terrible. Even with the power base, I have leaning heavily towards fire. It's just super hard for a 2-faction deck like this to hit triple fire on turn 4 consistently. Even the original deck that Unearthly had leaned heavy on the fire influence, and that hasn't changed with this deck. And when I did get to play Groundbreaker, the card honestly didn't do much, even on turn 4. Opposing decks, they just had ways to deal with it, particularly Permafrost, Suffocate, and Annihilate. I'm 100% convinced this card is strictly for mono fire decks and nothing else. Even 2-faction decks leaning heavy on fire influence can't play this guy consistently enough. Finally, I want to talk about Piercing Shot. This was part of my quest to find direct damage cards that helped fill the gap that Flame Blast and Charchain Flail left. I always thought Piercing Shot was slightly underrated. It's a card that would blow me out in games every once in a while. And yes, I am talking about Constructed. Now, I tested 2 copies of these, and unfortunately it just wasn't good enough. The card's just overall far too narrow, and it was surprisingly difficult for me to get additional value from it by killing a 2-health unit, even in situations where units did damage to each other in combat. When Crimson Firemaw became available, I cut the card entirely. Next, and well, I guess finally, I want to talk about the future of this archetype. And the future really is just cards I do want to test out. And it's less so that about, is this deck going to be good? Because I'm honestly not sure at this point. I think it could be. I mean, aggro is just consistent in general. So there's a pretty good chance that in the future, this deck will continue to be good. Even if it's not right now, then it will be at some point. At least I feel, but you never know. Anyway, focusing on cards that I want to try out in the future. First is Vanquish, and I'm sure some of you were wondering why Vanquish is not in this list at all. The reason, quite simply, is that Vanquish doesn't do direct damage, so it doesn't fit the game plan. Now, you could cut a sort of a Karia and even a Fearless Nomad for 2 copies, which is what I am thinking about, but you will have games where you end up drawing Vanquish, wishing it was that card you cut that actually dealt damage. Yes, Vanquish hits Sandstorm Titan. Yes, it hits Tavrod. But as good as Vanquish is, there are matchups where you will have little to no targets to use it on. And while it can clear the way for your units to get damage in, it's not a burn spell in the purest sense at the end of the day. Keep in mind, I haven't run Vanquish this whole time and still maintained an overall decent win rate when Tavrod was everywhere, compared to before during the Omens metagame after Flame Blast got nerfed. Now, if time-based mid-range in particular absolutely floods the metagame though, and I mean flood it, it'd have to be a lot, then they're a consideration. And finally, I want to talk about Cinder Yeti, as opposed to Ijin Imperial Armor. So the idea here is that Cinder Yeti has a lower ceiling than Ijin, but also has a lower floor than Ijin. For those new, that means that Cinder Yeti at his worst isn't as bad as Ijin at her worst. But Ijin at her best is better than Cinder Yeti at his best. Cinder Yeti does fit the game plan for this deck though, and has Overwhelm for additional evasion, and Warp is also a big deal. He'll pretty much do what he's supposed to do, but not much else beyond that. Whereas Ijin is more all over the place. She is ridiculous when she goes off, and underwhelming when she doesn't. I may test this in the future, and I also think Cinder Yeti is definitely the pick if you don't have Ijin or don't want to craft her, which is totally understandable. But there you go. That's my personal experience playing Rakano Burn. That was Unearthly's baby, but it's just something I've attempted to refine for the past several months. But for those that made it to the end, I want to thank you so much for watching and listening to my experiences tweaking this deck and where I'm at with it right now. Feel free to like this video if you enjoyed it. For anyone that's curious, I've done previous videos like this in the past focusing on other archetypes. So if you are interested in those, feel free to check them out. And I'll have a link to a playlist on your screen. For those curious about whether I have other Eternal content, feel free to look around the channel. There's quite a bit of it. In addition to these types of discussions, there's a series called Eternal Errors, if you ever want to look at misplays I make with certain decks and learn from those mistakes. There's also some drafts, ladder highlights, some event runs I've done, and even some set reviews. Also, if you don't want to miss future content, consider subscribing to the channel. And thanks again for taking time out of your day to watch this, and I'll see you all soon. Take care.